This is Proxy Countdown. Welcome to the big show for the week of May 19th, 2024. I'm Matt Moscardi filling in for Damian Rollis on today's Countdown. A mysterious CEO departure that respects, quote, individuals' privacy. Pension fund that isn't holding back at Exxon. Meanwhile, investors are holding back at Boeing. And on the big vote, a strategy for dealing with dual-class companies like Meta. Let's kick it off with the trade wire. On May 18th, Kenneth Wilson ceased to serve as Chief Executive Officer and Director of Jabil, Inc., following the completion of an announced internal investigation related to corporate policies. A spokesperson for the company said in an email that, quote, in order to respect the privacy and confidentiality of the individuals involved, we will not be speaking about the details of the investigation or the results. Wilson had to enter into an agreement with Jabil that subjected him to a 2-year non-compete, ongoing obligation to cooperate and make himself reasonably available to Jabil, a non-disparagement, confidentiality, non-disclosure requirement, and a requirement to assist Jabil in the event of certain legal proceedings. And for violating what clearly is the investigation or the corporate policy, he will need to be available for those legal proceedings. And Jabil decided that it would be nice if he got a payment of $2 million, less taxes, in 8 quarterly installments of $250,000 each, and he gets to retain his long-term incentive awards vesting in 2024. So not clear what's actually happening here at Jabil. There's been no disclosure around it, but clearly they're anticipating some sort of legal proceeding. It violated corporate policies. It happened all of a sudden. There's been a shift. The board now has been reduced to 9 people and will stay that way for the immediate future. And Jabil has to keep quiet to get his $2 million and his vested options. Otherwise, those are claw-backable. In other news, Vanguard named former BlackRock executive as CEO Salim Ramji, who led BlackRock's ETF business, left in January, is named the CEO of Vanguard. Here's the question. Does that mean we can likely expect the proxy votes at Vanguard to mirror BlackRock's? And the open question then is, if all the executives at these passive managers are traded to each other, should we just expect univotes? Did we ostensibly achieve unithink in voting? We'll find out soon enough, but that is the news from the trade wire. Let's move on to our proxy cage matches. Only 2 things to talk about here today. I think the big one here is CalPERS. CalPERS, the California pension fund, announced that it will vote against all 12 Exxon directors, citing the lawsuit that Exxon filed against Arjuna Capital and Follow This. They said in a letter to their members that the legal action that Exxon has taken, quote, could diminish the role and the rights of every investor in improving a company's bottom line. The shareholder meeting, we covered Exxon here on Proxy Countdown last week with some recommendations. You have to hand it to CalPERS. They went all in. They are set to vote against every single director in the meeting next week, a week from today. So kudos to them for that. It's not exactly a proxy cage match, but it's close enough. In our second story, Tesla's chair had this to say about the wealth that she gained from being on Tesla's board. She says life-changing wealth has boosted her independence and blasted the judge's critique of the board and their, quote, lackadaisical oversight. She did say she had to look up what the term lackadaisical meant, but once she figured out what it meant, and she said, I am definitely not that thing. But the fact here is she's calling that the board being too close to Musk is, quote, absolute BS. and that the role of the chair is to make sure the board has a good relationship with the CEO and the executive team. We're there, quote, we're there on behalf of shareholders to make sure that management is doing their job, and their job is primarily to grow shareholder value over time. So interesting that basically this is the board fighting back and saying they are independent. Forget what a Delaware judge says. Forget what the data suggests, how intertwined they are. They are all about shareholder value, not about individual value, despite the fact that they are all incredibly wealthy as a result of being on this board and access to Musk, even if not directly through Tesla's share price. So those are our two stories in the proxy cage match. Let's move over quickly to our vote results table. Focusing just on the large cap, the largest cap are what we call League 3 and 4. The big story here is Boeing. Dave Calhoun reelected to the board. 23% said no. David Joyce actually got a higher percentage of no votes. 34% said no to David Joyce, who is the head of the safety committee. He joined the board in 2020. The vote doesn't make much sense, given that these issues far predate David Joyce. These issues date back to 2011 and long-standing supply chain issues and a willingness to cut corners by the management team. Calhoun also, his say on pay, he got a 45% raise in pay. That passed. 38% said no. And included in that pay package is actually $45 million of potential money compensation after he leaves should the share price increase by 37%. $5 million of that is immediately vested upon him leaving. His planned departure date is later this year, sometime in the fall. Absurdly high votes for at a couple of companies. DraftKings, which is a dual class company, but still 99.91% yes on Paul Lieberman, 99.91% yes on Matthew Kalish, 99.9% yes on Jocelyn Moore. Question is, somebody needs to ask Jocelyn Moore why she got 0.01% less than the other two. 99.91 for the two dudes, 99.90 for Jocelyn Moore. What is that? Who's the 0.01% who said, Jocelyn's not as good? At AIG, American International Group, John Inglis, 99.6% yes, despite hitting a whopping 132 TSR. When we look at TSR, when we do director performance attribution, we are looking across all the boards that they're on, and we compare it to sector and size peers, which means Inglis is batting 132. He is in the bottom 15th percentile. He's the 13th percentile effectively for TSR. Still gets a 99.6% yes vote. A couple of notes on say on pay, over 20% no votes. 3M failed say on pay at 55% no. BlackRock got a 41% no. Travelers Companies, 40% no. AIG, 36% no. Cleveland Cliffs, 26%. Enphase Energy, 25%. In fact, at Enphase, there was one director who got, in the last week, who got a 20% or more no vote against them individually, and that was Joseph Malchow. There are a couple other big no votes for directors. All of them passed. I think the biggest here is Alexandria Real Estate Equities, 43% no for James Kane, but every one of them still reelected. So even when investors are angry, that it's hard to muster enough anger to actually boot a director off the board. Traction on simple majority voting continues. ConocoPhillips passed with 99% yes for simple majority voting, and Akame Technologies passed 91% yes. We're seeing this trend. Simple majority voting seems to be a focus of shareholders this year. Continued support for simple majority shareholder proposals. One odd vote to go over here at Skyworks Solutions. Despite receiving about 99% support from shareholders, because they needed a vote of 80% of the shares outstanding, All and 90% of shares outstanding for Proposal 5, all the shareholder proposals did not pass. They could not get enough shareholders in the room. And this is the problem with these supermajority shareholder vote requirements to change bylaws. They did not, shareholders did not approve, even though they did not approve an amendment to the restated certificate of incorporation to eliminate supermajority vote provisions for mergers and consolidations. The same thing for business combinations, the same things for stockholder amendments to the charter governing directors, the same thing for amendments to the charter governing actions by stockholders. So Skyworks Solutions, despite the fact that a massive amount of support comes in for those shareholders that did vote, because they couldn't pass the share outstanding minimum set by the company, that these things do not end up passing. So another weird quirk of these markets. Let's get on to the big vote. In today's big vote, we are talking about Meta platforms. But I'm going to talk about something else first. And here's where we're going to get philosophical. Meta is the encapsulation of a long-standing governance problem, which is how, if you are an investor, do you deal with a totalitarian board? These are dual-class dictatorships. They're fake public companies. Investors tolerate these boards largely when they IPO due to FOMO or fear of what they think might be losing key talent in a company founder. Usually, these are structured so that the founders and oftentimes VCs who funded the founders, they benefit largely from the IPO and the ongoing company. It is a way for a company to be public, but also private because they retain voting control. In our minds, this is actually the risk assessment here. It's an asymmetric trade. Investors lose this asymmetric trade every single time because either the totalitarian companies, by giving dual class shares, it's not really about keeping a founder along for the ride. They're not going anywhere. This is about choosing a set of people for the founder to keep control of the company, not just the founder themselves often. It removes guardrails. You have the kabuki theater of a board who is hand-chosen by the founder, and you can choose your friends, and you can basically enrich your friends and keep them close without actually having any guardrails on the company because you have the control of the company if you're that dual-class holder, or you're a couple of dual-class holders, or the founder that controls the company. And the likelihood that a founder would actually leave if not granted dual-class shares is near zero. In fact, we know this because the market is functionally totalitarian already. The average for vote for a director is 96%. We just talked about it. Only 0.2% of directors are voted out on an annual basis. In fact, the argument for totalitarianism, including at Meta, has largely rested on the idea that we need time. We want to take a long-term perspective. We need to be able to underperform so that we can scale growth later and dominate later. That argument doesn't actually hold water when you look at how investors vote. The average vote in favor of directors in the bottom 10% of earnings, or TSR, this is the average vote for directors who underperform. In the bottom 10% is 95.6 and 96.5% respectively, meaning directors, for the worst of the worst, vote them in at an over 95% rate. In fact, the top 10% of earners in TSR get exactly the same votes, 95.9% or 98% respectively, meaning there is no difference between the bottom performers and the top performers when it comes to how investors vote. So the argument that we need to focus on the long term, given the fact that investors give every director, every person at these companies the long term already, doesn't hold water. Only one director last year at U.S. large cap companies was voted out who performed in the bottom 10% of TSR. Two directors were voted out, and they performed above the 50th percentile in TSR or EBITDA. So it doesn't hold any water. You don't need dual class shares in order to focus on the long term, because the directors and the people in charge almost never get voted out. Dave Calhoun has proven that you can tank a company over a decade and you will still maintain your board seat if you're the CEO, even if you're not the founder. So management chooses their own boards without resistance from investors. You are functionally totalitarian already. And this is, you can see, we just talked about Tesla. You can see this given the fact that Elon's brother and best friends have been on this board, and up until a court voided his pay package, no one said anything about the fact that they were on the board. It's a functional totalitarian, even though it's one share, one vote, by virtue of the influence exerted by Elon both on investors and on the board itself. It's functionally totalitarian, a dictatorship as it is. So I don't know that an investor should be okay with a dual class situation, given that the founders already enjoy dictatorships by virtue of being founders and CEOs and the votes that they get. They already basically have complete control. Why, as an investor, would anyone be okay with giving them actual control and eliminating any possibility in the future that an investor can change anything? So let's talk about Meta specifically. Let's size the problem of what are totalitarian boards, because I'm talking about the idea of a totalitarian board, but let's size the problem. We define a totalitarian board as a board where a single person or a set of family or founders own more than 50% of the influence at that board. They can own that influence via shareholdings, via dual class share structures, legacy shares from a family, longtime founder status. There are a lot of ways you can do it. It can be at a one share, one vote company, which is the case at Amazon, where you have the executive chairship of Jeff Bezos. It can be the case at Tesla, where the founder has chosen the entire board. His brother's on the board, and even though it's one share, one vote, it's a classified board. He owns a vast block of shares. Or it could be like it is at Meta, where you have Zuckerberg, who has less economic interest than others in in Meta, but 51% control. That is the case at Snap. It is the case at Spotify. There are a number of companies that use this to maintain control, despite the fact that they don't have an economic interest. If you size the problem, if that is what we're calling totalitarian for the purposes of this conversation, there are 610 U.S. large cap boards that we looked at. 145 of them are totalitarian. 24% of the U.S. market is basically controlled. In fact, there are 1,400, just under 1,500 directors on these totalitarian boards. 202 of those directors are on multiple totalitarian boards. These are basically shareholder oligarchs. The largest of which is Greg Maffei. He's on 6, mostly family firms or family-run firms. And then there's Rolef Botha, who he is on Khosla. He's a VC. He's on 5 totalitarian boards. These are people who go from board to board, and their job is effectively to hold up the dictator, because they are chosen or they have shareholdings in dictatorships. So considering that 24% of U.S. large cap investors' portfolios would be totalitarian, they have ceded rights and influence over their own capital stewards at these companies. I think there's a solution for this. And it's not necessarily easy. It might be uncomfortable, but let's look at it from Meta. And that's how we're going to approach Meta. Assuming that directors are still humans with incentives, which they are, even if they're on a totalitarian board where your vote largely doesn't matter. And this is the hard thing to parse. Like, how do you approach Meta when you know that Zuckerberg owns 51% of the vote? Those directors sitting on the boards, many of them, most of them, in fact, 1,200 of them, sit on other boards. They have careers and they sit on other boards. Our philosophy here will be with the goal of persuading a director to sunset dual class shares or cede more control to shareholders, to basically stand up to dictators where there's one share, one vote, or to sunset dual class where there isn't one share, one vote. We think you can engage directors not on the companies where there is a dictator, but on the companies where there isn't. Meaning use your vote on other boards to influence the makeup of a board like Meta. So in Meta's case, Meta's board is 11 people strong, of which there are 7 directors who sit on other boards. 4 of those directors sitting on multiple dictator boards. Drew Houston is a dictator at Dropbox, and he's sitting on Meta's board. Hock Tan, a dictator at Broadcom, sitting on Meta's board. Mark Andreessen, he's on 2 other dictator boards, and he is getting there by being a VC. He's on the boards of Coinbase and Samsara and Meta. So all dictator boards. And Tony Xu of DoorDash. He's a dictator at DoorDash, and he gets to sit on the Meta board. This is a huge problem because dictators reinforce dictators. They don't provide guardrails. Mark Andreessen's job is not to give guardrails to Mark Zuckerberg. It is tell him to blitzscale, tell him to break things, tell him use all of the personal information you can to scale up your AI capabilities and worry about the implications later. There's an argument to be made here that you could go through every one of these boards, Coinbase, Samsara, DoorDash, Broadcom, Dropbox, and cascade votes against directors who sit on other boards through those boards. But let's just focus on Meta for now. If 4 of the directors are basically off limits because they are sitting on only boards full of dictators, that leaves us 3 pressure points at Meta. Tracy Travis, who sits on the Accenture board, Nancy Killefer, who sits on the Cardinal Health board. She's also on Certera, but that's basically a dictator. And Peggy Alford, who's on the Macerich board. Now, it's likely not a coincidence that these 3 are the only 3 women on the Meta board who didn't work at Meta. Sheryl Sandberg, still on the Meta board, basically is Meta, right? So these are the 3 quote unquote independent board members who are on other boards and have other considerations. I don't like it any more than anyone else will, that you have to pressure the women and engage and vote against women on other boards, because there already is a problem getting women on boards and in positions of power. But this is how power gets consolidated, right? So let's go one by one. Peggy Alford, she's ex-Microsoft board. In fact, it's reasonable to assume Gates is a mentor to Zuckerberg, and that's well known. Alford was on the Microsoft board. There's likely a direct connection from Gates to Alford on the Meta board, right? She's been a Meta director since 2019. Overall, she bats 490 on TSR, 490 for EBITDA, so middle of the pack. She has a negative 959 million cap value add. Not great there. But she's been on Macerich's board since 2018. She has 6% of the influence. Macerich has its own problems. Enrique Hernandez, is a poster child of board failure, sitting on the Macerich board. Rick Hernandez was at Wells Fargo, Chevron, McDonald's. There's Chicago links Alfred has. It is not reasonable is the wrong word. It is uncomfortable, but I think there's a protest vote to be had here. Not at Meta, but at Macerich with Peggy Alford. Nancy Killefer, high influence outside of Meta. Actually, a really poor EBITDA performer. She's on the board of Cardinal Health. Her EBITDA performance overall is 183, 535 for TSR. She's been on the board of Cardinal Health since 2015. She's the paid chair there. And Tracy Travis, who actually might be the most compromised of the potential targets. Travis sat on the Campbell Soup board, which is another dictatorship, with Sarah Matthew, who sits on Dropbox's board. So basically, it's like an oligarch loop we have with dictator enablers. She also has links to Robert Kimmett, who's on this board, was on Lufthansa at one point, but not anymore, through Accenture. And that's where Tracy Travis can be sort of targeted, at the Accenture board. She has the lowest TSR performance of the trio and a batting average for controversies of 0.24. It's horrible. She's been on the Accenture board since 2017 and Meta since 2020. Here are my recommendations, and we're going to wrap the show with these recommendations. I think there's a protest vote that's easy if you are a Meta shareholder. You vote against all directors simply because you didn't get to choose them. And I think you vote for every shareholder proposal, including there's a genius shareholder proposal from the Illinois State Treasurer looking for vote disclosure by share class. This is effectively saying, how did Mark vote? Because Mark obviously is voting for everything, but let's not speculate. Let's not speculate where the 10-1 final vote tallies came from. Tell us how Mark voted and how everyone else voted. That is really smart, because then you know shareholders are upset with how Meta's board gets chosen. They want change at Meta in terms of their rights at Meta, but you can't see that because when you disclose the final vote, you're simply saying that it was for and the vast majority of the votes were, in favor. Meanwhile, the vast majority of those votes are Mark Zuckerberg. So this is a great shareholder proposal. Vote for it. The proposal for a one share, one vote structure is up again. Vote for that. Even the National Legal Policy Center, which is an anti-woke, anti-ESG play, is asking for a report on the minimum age of social media being 12 years old. Vote for them all. Vote for that one too. And I think from a director standpoint, the action here is to engage and vote in other elections. In fact, on May 30th, next week, Peggy Alford comes up for another board for re-election, not at Meta, but at Macerich. There is the opportunity here to vote against Peggy Alford at Macerich, aiming for sub 90%. I don't think you should kick her off Macerich's board because she's on Meta's board. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I think the conversation needs to get set, needs to get started, where what we want at the other boards that you're on, where there are dictators in place, is sunsetting those dictatorships. That could start with an abstention with Peggy Alford at Macerich. Meanwhile, you can engage with Nancy Killefer at Cardinal with a threat of an abstention in November of this year at the Cardinal Health AGM, and engage with Tracy Travis going into the Accenture vote in 2025, all of which the looming threat of abstentions into votes against, should you not begin the process, or at least the conversation, of sunsetting dual class shares that Zuckerberg holds. The fact is, Mark Zuckerberg holds way too much power. It's a social media monopoly, and it's resulted in a myriad of academic studies linking it to teen depression, the contravention of democracy, all sorts of issues. And he just cut funding to his fake oversight board already. The oversight board, which was supposed to be his Supreme Court, that was paid for by, it's like if you paid for your own Supreme Court, who are they going to vote for? But still, even the optics of having oversight are steadily being eroded at a place like Meta. This is the only way I can think to get in. To go for directors that have seats at other boards where you have a say, to engage them there, to engage them. You talk to them through Meta, but say, look, the only place we have leverage here is at these other boards where you have seats. And the threat of losing those board seats, if we can't do something to sunset these dual class shares, is the only way I can think to begin this conversation. So I'm going to stop there. Because that's already a lot. It's a lot from one dude talking the whole time. Nobody likes to hear one dude talk the whole time. Or we miss Damien, but he'll be back next week. That's the Proxy Countdown. Join us next week when we jump back into the alternative democracy pool. Forever on the lookout for shareholder sharks, floating band-aids, and wayward directors.